Welcome, everybody. What I was just saying is that David Graeber will be here in just a second. He's upstairs being interviewed. Great to have you here. I'm Lawrence Weschler. I'm the director of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU. And with James Miller, I'm one of the co-conveners of this gathering. Just to explain very quickly how this is going to go, we're going to have 3 sessions. In each of the 3 sessions, there'll be a different group of us at the center table. There will be an initial, as you see on your pages here, an initial statement by one of us, followed by responses by the others at the center table, a little conversation among us here, and then it will widen out to the wider table, and then there will be time for interventions from the audience at the 2 microphones here. We are not going to spend any time on introductions. They're on the back of the paper here, and that'll help us save time. So I guess I'll just start by saying a few very quick things. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Is that David? Come on up here. Here he comes.
And Teresa's coming.
Oh, that's right. And
Teresa Gallarducci will be here in a bit.
In a bit also. Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's always struck me that the truly revolutionary advance in that declaration is contained not so much in the words truths or self-evident or unalienable or even created equal, as in the phrase we hold. You would think by strict logic that it would have been written, it is self-evident that all men are created equal. But in fact, it's not at all self-evident. In fact, eons of history, tyrants of all sorts, including the tyranny of the market, believe just the opposite. It becomes self-evident, and it only becomes self-evident. The self-evidence of the assertion only manifests itself when people rise up to embrace it, to hold fast to its insistence, mutually pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in the process. It is holding such truths to be self-evident that first makes them so, and more specifically, holding them in concert. And it seems to me that that is one of the many great things that happened with Occupy Wall Street. It happens over and over again historically when these moments arise. But I think all of us up here feel that something truly astonishing happened with Occupy Wall Street, a kind of blockage, an inability to have that kind of fact be asserted. For something like 30 years now, 30 or 40 years, there has been this blockage gradually chipping away. But that Occupy Wall Street, and I think David maybe later will talk about how it was, even to the surprise of the people doing it, caught something magical, caught something, a huge, enormous spark. And all of us in the body politic should be grateful and thankful to them for that, which is another way of being thankful to us, those of us who participated. But at this point, it seems to me, and the reason we convene this meeting is that it seems to me that the Occupy movement, the left in general, is facing a whole group of challenges in the months ahead. How to transition from that initial spark to something more ongoing and something more lasting. So that's the basic terrain we'll be covering today, and I'm going to give it to Jim Miller to start us off.
Thanks, Ren. I just want to reiterate again what Ren has said, and it's to emphasize, I think, the obvious, but let me say it again. It's amazing the extent to which so far Occupy Wall Street has been successful. It has compelled the media in this country to pay fresh attention to problems of inequality and injustice. The New York Times, which normally hasn't paid much attention to these topics, has begun to run stories on income inequality. It's provoked a fresh interest in social change, and particularly among young people. It's reignited hope in the possibility of a free society, and it's reignited hope and interest in utopian possibilities. And it's done this in part by resurrecting one of the defining aspects of the 1960s, an overriding commitment to participatory democracy, understood as the making of decisions in a face-to-face community of friends and not through elected representatives. That said, I have some questions about the direction of the movement, and I think they're worth raising, particularly at this point, because I think the movement stands at a kind of crossroads where decisions have to be made about the best directions forward. A quarter century ago, I wrote a book entitled Democracy is in the Streets, From Port Huron to the Siege of Chicago. And it really is a study of the 60s experiment in participatory democracy. In my view, the most important conclusion to draw from the experience of the 60s was to demonstrate, I'm quoting myself now, the incompatibility of rule by consensus with accountable, responsible government in a large organization, or even in a small group of people with divergent interests and a limited patience for endless meetings. But this modest lesson has proved very hard to learn, perhaps because, as I also wrote, quote, for anyone who joined in the search for a democracy of individual participation, and certainly for anyone who remembers the happiness and holds to the hopes that the quest itself aroused, the sense of what politics can mean will never be quite the same again. The result for many subsequent groups on the global left has been an unstable political idealism, an amalgam of direct action and direct democracy, with many of the virtues of a utopian and romantic revolt, passion, moral conviction, a shared joy in the joining of battle, but also some of the vices. Above all, an obsession with the purity of democratic process, and a zeal for enabling autonomous militant groups to act as they please, no matter the negative political implications for more moderate political allies. It's too soon to say if America's current experiment with participatory politics can elaborate new forms that might solve some of these problems. But I don't think it's too soon to make a few observations about some current dilemmas. Although the joy of collectively creating a new political space was palpable last fall in Zuccotti Park, those feelings has dimmed as OWS has dug in. The General Assemblies run by consensus, at least in New York City, I think have diminished somewhat in importance. Effective decision-making on many matters, both logistical and political, has devolved to a number of working groups that meet separately and have fallen under the effective control of various individuals who have assumed de facto power within the movement, even though all working groups are still ostensibly run by consensus. In an effort to acknowledge these problems, the General Assembly in Zuccotti Park voted to institute an operational spokescouncil, which began to meet regularly in November on nights when the General Assembly wasn't in session. In this way, among others, the occupation in New York City slowly but surely has turned from what David Graeber has called, quote, experiences of visionary inspiration to a much slower, painstaking struggle of creating alternative institutions. But that is not all. For besides proceeding in a slower and more painstaking manner, the groups working on direct action, especially any that are planning a more or less militant direct action, naturally have put a premium on solidarity and discretion, not an open airing of doubts and disagreements. It is tempting for the most important members of such groups to meet privately, in an effort to avoid the inconvenience of endless meetings open to anyone, including informers and police. And if this in fact happens, a movement begins to elaborate a hidden structure. Cadre and the know are able to shuttle between secret meetings and public assemblies that attract large numbers of potential sympathizers. This duplicitous structure, familiar from communist fronts and some radical anarchist organizations like Bakunin's so-called Secret and Universal Association of the International Brothers in 1869, and also used by some New Left groups in the late 60s, enables underground organizers to mold the views and direct the actions of those gathered in more public assemblies. In effect, a public show of democracy risks becoming a facade, a front for a small vanguard of de facto leaders. Meanwhile, as David Graeber has observed, and as veterans of the battle in Seattle and other transcendental moments of embattled moral clarity can attest, street fighting with police can be heady, even transporting. I quote David Graeber, "It is a way to create one fleeting moment when autonomy is real and immediate, a space of liberated territory in which the laws and arbitrary power of the state no longer apply, in which we draw the lines of force ourselves." After my own participation in the whole world is watching showdown between police and protesters in Chicago in August 1968, and similarly electrified by that confrontation, I, like other militants of my generation, heaped scorn on the dreary compromises involved in electoral politics. I was quite certain I never wanted to have anything to do with the system, given what I had been through. And this brings me to perhaps the most insidious paradox of participatory democracy, when a movement that pursues its aims through polarizing protests simultaneously demands consensus in its public organs of self-government. The paradox, I think, unfolds as follows. The success of a polarizing movement hinges on obtaining publicity and sympathetic attention from outsiders. The surest way to obtain such publicity is through demonstrations that prompt a disproportionate and flagrantly unjust response from the police, from the authorities. Meanwhile, back in the public assemblies, the demand for consensus willy-nilly puts the most uncompromising militants, including many of those who in fact have spurred the growth of the movement and have become militant activists by taste as well as by political conviction, in a position in which they can veto the tactics and strategy proposed by more cautious comrades. The group becomes polarized. The militants, in some cases, go underground. But consensus remains the holy grail of the public meetings, and the moderates in the group are by definition inclined to compromise. Indeed, in this context, ideological disputes are informally discouraged, since any open debate, for example, over the value of so-called black bloc tactics or the meaning of the group's ostensible commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience, might undermine the group's solidarity and might violate the autonomy of the most militant individuals in the larger association. So, the moderates silence their reservations and in some cases simply choose to drop out of the movement. Officially, a diversity of tactics may even be endorsed, but the consensus view that prevails in public is generally the most radical alternative on offer, an extreme illustration of what Cass Sunstein has called the law of group polarization. I want to conclude with a series of questions inspired in part by a statement issued by Occupy Oakland after the mayor of Oakland, Jean Quan, had said, this is after the events of January 28th, Jean Quan had said the vandalism and flag burning at Oakland City Hall that Saturday was, quote, like a tantrum. The response comes from Wendy Kennan, a spokeswoman for Occupy Oakland. I quote her now, "I don't think that Mayor Quan is weighing the big picture. The small amount of destruction caused by these autonomous people that may or may not be part of Occupy Oakland versus the kind of destruction against the environment, working people, and poor people. Hence my questions. Where do people here stand on vandalism and violence as tactics as a means of social change? Is there any limit this movement can and should try to set on the tactics of autonomous people, sometimes masked autonomous people, who may or may not be part of the movement? What role should secrecy in vanguard organization play? More generally, how active should OWS itself be in making alliances with individuals and communities and organizations that, for whatever reason, don't have the time or taste for participatory democracy and yet may share many of the movement's other aspirations? How, if at all, should their views be represented in the deliberations of OWS? On the one hand, endless meetings, it is true, I know this from the 60s, can be a drag and a big nuisance. But shouldn't the general assemblies of the Occupy movement be able to discuss openly and honestly the pros and cons of broader or narrower coalitions and the pros and cons of more or less violent forms of direct action? Those are my questions. So, here.
Shouldn't we stick with it? Shouldn't we stick with the alphabet, Ren? No. Am I audible?
Yeah.
There. How's that? Okay. Oh boy. So first, I want to start by thanking New York for Occupy. It's been a gorgeous, beautiful, amazing, astonishing thing that we on the West Coast have been very happy to receive and collaborate with. So, okay, everybody likes being complimented. But, you know, and for me, I spent a lot of time reading histories of revolutions, disasters, carnivals, and writing about them. These moments of incredible upheaval when all men are brothers and anything is possible. How many of you here have ever been in love? We won't look for the people who aren't raising their hands. But you know that there's that incredible heady moment where you feel like you have everything in common, nothing separates you. It's a beautiful dream. What process, what boundaries. We're just so happy together. It's so great. Every revolution has that at its outset, and it's important, and you can revive that like a carnival, the way you can revive your honeymoon in certain ways, and we won't talk about how. And but it feels like in the fall we had this incredible honeymoon, like nothing I've ever seen before, where, you know, tenure-track people and homeless people, people of all colors, liberals and far-left radicals, etc., felt something so deep in common. And it wasn't just fury and hatred for Wall Street. It was a deep love and empathy for the victims of Wall Street, for each other, for the sense of possibility, and something I've seen over and over again in revolution and disaster, which is the sudden joy of stepping into the power, the awakeness, and the solidarity of being a member of civil society. That moment when you are no longer living in private, you're no longer voiceless, you're no longer isolated, you're deeply connected, you're empowered, you're part of this beautiful force that can change the world, that is the change of the world already transformed. So, and then, you know, that's the honeymoon. Then somebody has to take out the garbage. And, you know, and that's fine. And, you know, I'm from Bohemian West Coast. There's a lot of people who think like after the honeymoon there's a problem and you abandon the other person and start all over. And but, you know, really, then after the honeymoon comes the relationship where it's like, actually we're really different and we're going to have to work on this and figure out what matters really deeply to us. What do we have in common? How do we continue to stay together? And that's, I think, where it gets really interesting. Honeymoons are really great. They sort of invigorate you. They connect you and bond you and inspire you in deep ways. And then comes the real relationship. And that's where we are now. And that's okay. That's more than okay. So, and I think when I think about Occupy Wall Street, I think that it was both this incredibly fresh new thing. The very idea of Occupy, this kind of is itself, in a romantic way, this kind of steadfast, committed, we're not going to go have one day or one afternoon or 1 week of action. We're here. And, you know, it's a way of being present that feels connected to the penchant for gardening and for this kind of idea of sustainability and permaculture and stuff that's been part of the conversation of the left. And there's a lot of new things, new words, new ways of doing things, new gestures. It also feels to me like this kind of magic culmination of 40 years of trying to undo the worst of the 60s. I hate talking about the 60s because I was there for almost all, somebody raised their hand like he does too. I was there for most of the 60s, but I was playing, you know, there were diapers and then there were plastic horses and dinosaurs and some dolls, some playing in the hills. You know, I was 8 when the 60s ended, and thank God. for the ending part. So, and I've been saddled with the legacy ever since. And the legacy's used to smear us, you know, that we're marginal, that we're privileged, etc. I've seen it with anti-globalization movement. I've seen it with, you know, with this movement. I've seen it with everything my whole life. That the 60s is kind of a burden of history that I wish we'd get over by being more historical and thinking more about, you know, 1848 or the 1930s or the amazing 1980s. But what I see Occupy also as a culmination of is overcoming the colossal mistakes of the 60s around well, you maybe, or maybe that was just the honeymoon, but about divisiveness. You know, that the model of the General Assembly, consensus process, etc., emerge out of feminism and people of color and the anti-nuclear movement in the 1970s and 80s, trying to do things better than they'd been done. There's a sense of openness because we're not going to be paranoid. One of the reasons we're not violent is so that some of us is, you know, in the bomb-throwing Weather Underground kind of way, as so that you don't get into paranoia and fear and conspiracy and undergrounding and FBI witch hunts and, you know, that stuff. Like, I know people in the Weather Underground, it didn't really work very well. So, and I have yet to see an example of violence on the left that's achieved anything exciting and fruitful in the last 40 or 50 years. So, but maybe I missed something. But so I feel like it's been both a brand new thing and a culmination. It's been great. It's been a honeymoon. The honeymoon's over. The relationship is still very rich and strong. And I think there's also a sense that I see all the time in activism, to think that if it didn't change everything in the whole world this very moment, then it was a failure. But it's changed, and I think, I totally agree with Jim, it's changed things so profoundly. It's changed the conversation. When you look at how the elected politicians are interacting and discuss what they're obliged to acknowledge and discuss now, that we've set the terms, we changed the debate. It's like this bizarre curse that was over us where we could never call economic injustice, injustice. We could never call greed, greed. We could never call the unnecessariness of poverty, the unnecessariness of poverty. We could, you know, we suddenly are calling things by their true names, and it's one of the huge gifts of this moment that's going on right now. So that's some of what I think has been remarkable and beautiful and amazing about this. And, you know, and this last week has been a lot of excitement about an extraordinarily silly piece by an extraordinarily uninformed person who referred to the black bloc as the cancer in Occupy. And I think if you think you're with nonviolence, you don't call people cancer at the outset. But what's been interesting, but it has been a discussion about violence and nonviolence and radical versus liberal. And I think kind of one of the crises that Occupy faces is that there was this beautiful honeymoon where people who are kind of reformers within the system and people who are extremely disaffected with the system, people for whom the system is kind of working but they'd like it to be a better system, and people who've been utterly trampled down by the system, like a lot of the poor kids and people of color in Oakland. And you know, and we're going to have to work that out. And part of how we're going to have to work that out is through what I consider nonviolence, which means that you're not divisive, you're not schismatic, you don't call names, you don't demonize people. And you know, if you're nonviolent, you're going to have to learn to love the black bloc in some way. And I'm looking at David to see what he thinks. And you know, you're going to have to. There's some really the whole country and maybe the whole world is having this heated debate, and what it's all about is 2 days in Oakland. How many of you have been to Oakland since November 2nd? Yeah, well, that makes 5 of us. I was there on November 2nd. I was there on January 28th. And those kids, they're passionate, they're dedicated. They're, you know, okay, Occupy was a honeymoon, but it's not really a couple. It's a family now. And these are the adolescents. And there's so many things that are beautiful and great about adolescents. They're passionate, they're devoted, they're fearless, they excoriate hypocrisy. They're going to be doing this stuff in 20 years, a lot of them, when a lot of old people are not doing anything at all. So, and there's a lot to love about them. And then there's some stuff, I think what constitutes violence is a big question. I think we should never forget when we talk about kids doing the smashy with graffiti and windows and stuff, that we're talking about a system that's created millions of people in incredible poverty in this country. We're talking about a system in which people around the world are dying, you know, thousands of them every hour, millions of them every year because of economic policy. We're talking about wars. We're talking about pilotless drones. We're talking about old people being evicted from their homes. We're talking about young people burdened with unbearable debt to pursue the sort of false hope of an education that will let them be part of the, you know, not the bottom of the 99%. And we're also talking about police brutality. If we want to talk about violence, we have to remember the real violence of people doing nonviolent resistance, being pepper sprayed in the face, of sleepers being clubbed as they slept at Occupy Wall Street in Oakland in the middle of the night, of an 80-year-old, you know, weeping with the tear gas that's been sprayed into her face, of a pregnant woman being tear gassed, of the poet laureate of the United States, Robert Haas, being bashed so badly in the ribs that he thought they were broken because he was trying to defend them from knocking down his wonderful, dainty poet wife, Brenda Hillman, at one of the campuses. That, you know, that we have to remember what violence is. I think that these, you know, and how the real violence that we're facing, and not get totally consumed in this extremely exciting thing in the foreground. And, you know, and I think that if we're going to be nonviolent people, it means that we have to respond to these things we don't agree with in a loving way. We have to acknowledge that sometimes property destruction isn't violent, sometimes it is, that it's all very slippery, and that we're only going to address it by having open and inclusive dialogues that don't demonize, don't divide, and don't necessarily have to come to an end, because this is a process, not a product. Thank you.
Yeah. No, you're next, or whatever it is. Go, Tom.
Can you hear me? We good?
Yep.
All right here? All right. Yeah, okay, so this is a lot to talk about. I'm not really sure how I'm going to do it, but I'll just ramble and then maybe it'll make sense. I think all the questions that have been posed and that have come out of the last two speakers and that are listed here, and that it all has to do with context, I think. I hope that's not a cop-out, but I think in order to answer any of those questions, we have to think about time and place and goal and vision and all that. And I think also in order to think about that, we should think about what we've done so far. And I would agree that we've done a lot. I think the Occupy movement's had a lot of really important victories already, particularly opening up space. I think that that's kind of the biggest victory. Is that, I mean, other people also said clogged. There were things that were clogged. I think that that's a really good way of looking at what we've done so far. All of this was impossible 4 months ago. So that's kind of the way that I look at it. My life was radically different from this form. I was like sitting depressed in my mom's basement. What the fuck am I gonna? And you know, and it's like, thank you. Yes. She's very nice. But so I mean, this is, you know, we're in a radically different place right now. A lot of things that were impossible are now possible. It's possible. There is an alternative. We are, you know, fumbling around trying to figure out what it is. People do fight back, even here. And so all of those things are kind of like the groundworks for a long-term struggle. Without that, it's just not, you know, even, you know, we're in some ways even on the offensive. Although we haven't won back the things that are being taken from us, you know, public schools are still being shut down in New York City, for example, we are in a new kind of I guess, mentality of we are allowed to go on the offensive. We're not only with our backs against the walls. We're not only having these things that we've had for 200 years being ripped away from us. So I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge right off the bat. And then Rebecca's honeymoon analogy is also the one that I use all the time. And I think that's exactly right. I think, you know, winter is another way to put it. It gets cold and we gotta, you know, it's not sustainable. On a practical level, it's not sustainable to have, for all these people who are running around the streets to have, you know, 16-hour days for the rest of their lives. That doesn't really, I can't, I don't. But, and so, you know, all of a sudden, people start to readjust. Like, it's not, you know, in the first 2 months, you drop everything, to do this thing because you're in love and because there's nothing that could possibly be wrong with your partner and everything's just, you know, whatever. And then you wake up one morning and, like, they have bad breath. It's, like, real, you know? It's, like, it's not all sexy. And you have to, yeah, and I have to start to work. And I think we're at the place now where we have to start to work. And also to keep with this analogy, I mean, there's Eric Fromm wrote a book called The Art of Loving, and I think the sort of the pinnacle, the centerpiece of that book is, if love is an art, we have to practice it. And so if we want to link that with this analogy, you know, if this is a serious thing, we've got to work. It's not just going to be magical. Although what Occupy Wall Street did, I think, was use a kind of moment to open up the possibility for what we're now engaging with, which is how do we have a meaningful social transformation, which is going to take a lifetime. And so I think that's the real question. And so all the other questions that have popped up from the last couple speakers, and also that are just kind of always there, that everybody here came in with these questions already, they all fit into that context. Where are we in the process of that meaningful transformation? What's useful for us now in the building of the movement that it's going to take to accomplish that? I would say we're at the very, very, very beginning of what might possibly, if we play our cards right, become a popular movement with the ability to create the institutions of the world we want to live while smashing the institutions that keep those on the margins. But we're only at the very, very beginning of that thing, which means it's going to take a whole lot to get us to that, and it's going to take a movement. So that's, I mean, definitely a prerequisite, I think, is a movement. And that's not a given. There are people who don't think that movements are important, think, and whatever, there are different kinds of tendencies with relationships to movement. I think a movement is a fundamental basis for that. I think what you see at the occupation, at the occupations, and also in the other little forms that have emerged from that, like the General Assembly or things like that, are the very seeds of the institutions that might carry out the values that we want to have in the future. But they're really only the very beginnings of those things. They're not necessarily functional, and they're not necessarily able to accommodate everyone, and so on. And the same thing is true for the sort of confrontation with the institutions of the status quo. We've shut down ports for short amounts of time, and we've, like, harassed the hell out of bank tellers and things like that. But that doesn't bring down finance capital or patriarchy or white supremacy or authoritarianism, obviously. But those are the very nuclei of a struggle like that. So I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go with this right now, but again, I think the questions about that was an incredibly roundabout way of saying that the questions about violence and vandalism, and I don't think they're the same, by the way, and the role of small groups inside of a bigger group, and the question of how do you connect to groups that are different from you. Those are all, again, contextual. I don't really think it's time to have conversations about violence. I don't think it's even remotely relevant yet. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it will be relevant. I think, people who threaten the status quo here are going to be faced with violence at some point if they become a real threat. That's just pretty much undeniable. But we're not there yet. I mean, and I'm not sure that that's what it's going to take to build them. Actually, I don't think that's what it's going to take to build the kind of movement that we need in order to even be in the position to engage in that question. And so right now, I think the question is, how do we build a movement that is broad enough where, that allows the different groupings inside of it to have the autonomy to carry out the kind of resistance that they need to carry out while being in solidarity with the larger group. And there's a lot of, that's a really nice way of saying it, autonomy within solidarity, but it gets messy. And so some of the people who have spoken are already brought up some of the messiness of it. I mean, there are some tactics that might not be in solidarity with everyone else. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not sure. I don't know if a black bloc can coexist with a movement that also includes struggling for electoral politics, but maybe. But I think that that's really the question. I think, what are the limits of the way that we can, what are the limits of our solidarity? I think that we need a movement where different people are doing different things. I don't want to have anything to do with electoral politics, but I sure as hell hope somebody does, because that's reality. I mean, and that's and in the here and now, that's a relevant thing to deal with. And I don't want to have to do that. Just like there are plenty of other things that I don't want to have to do in the movement. But you know, there are a lot of different fronts on this battle, and we're only at the very beginning. So I think trying to create that kind of broad movement is the priority right now. And I don't know, should I keep rambling or am I done? Okay.
You have to really get close to this mic, really close.
Well, I'm afraid after hearing from YOTAM that we shouldn't talk about nonviolence. Nonviolence is the thing I plan to talk about. but maybe I can be responsive to his points. Not so good. Closer. Okay. I want to begin, though, by reading a quotation, and this is from the great Václav Havel, who died recently, as you know, and it comes from his essay, The Power of the Powerless, written in 1979, or first published in 1979. You know what happened to the system that he posed. It's gone under the waves of history, so I think it's quite interesting, and it was quite surprising to me when I found it to find what he thought at that time, even then, about the civilization that we were in and are still in. So here's what he said. The post-totalitarian system is only one aspect, a particularly drastic aspect, and thus all the more revealing of its real origins, of this general inability of modern humanity to be the master of its own situation. And then more particularly, he said, about us, it would seem that the traditional parliamentary democracies can offer no fundamental opposition to the automatism of technological civilization and the industrial consumer society, for they too are being dragged helplessly along by it. People are manipulated in ways that are infinitely more subtle and refined than the brutal methods used in the post-totalitarian societies, but this static complex of rigid, conceptually sloppy, and politically pragmatic mass political parties run by professional apparatuses and releasing the citizen from all forms of concrete and personal responsibility, and those complex focuses of capital accumulation engaged in secret manipulations and expansion, the omnipresent dictatorship of consumption, production, advertising, commerce, consumer culture, and all that flood of information, all of it so often analyzed and described, can only with great difficulty be imagined as the source of humanity's rediscovery of itself. So he kind of said it all way back from 1979. And as I say, in view of what happened to the system he opposed, maybe there's some hope here. And I just wanted, by way of paying my tribute to Occupy, I want to say that I hope and have a confidence that this is the beginning of the unraveling of these things that Havel talked about that afflict us. Anyway, on to nonviolence. We've got several hours ahead of us, so what I'm going to do rather quickly is just offer a few propositions without arguing too much of things I believe about nonviolence and really offer them up for discussion. And the first proposition is that I think it will be better in every way if the Occupy movement or whatever movement grows out of it remains nonviolent and, what is I think especially important, commits itself very clearly and unequivocally to nonviolence. And so far, as YOTAM has pointed out, there has been very little violence, so maybe we shouldn't get too excited about it and get too worried about it. Nevertheless, I see this as a very positive force and a very positive decision. It's not just a matter of avoiding harm. Because to date, Occupy has really taken its place. It's taken a sort of recent place in a glorious tradition of nonviolent, militant, democratic, direct action that really stretches from Gandhi way back in 1906 in South Africa to the Solidarity movement in Poland and Havel's Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and I'm skipping over about 30 other movements, to the Arab Spring, and finally to Occupy, and now for good measure, the kind of sub-zero activism of the hundreds of thousands of people who have suddenly turned out in Moscow. An amazing development. Maybe China is next. So these movements really undid the two greatest empires of their time, or were instrumental in that, and that would be the British and the Soviet. And also they did much to remedy the greatest social wrong in the United States, and that would be racial prejudice and racial segregation. So we're not talking here about the small change of history. So that's why I say that nonviolent political action is an incredibly promising and fruitful way to go. And so when I commend it, I have that in mind. I think there are two fundamental problems with violence. One is that violence is part, and a big part, of what's wrong with the system. That's violence to human beings, and that's violence to nature, all of which we can blow off the face of the earth in several ways now. So obviously you don't want to become part of the machine. And that's why Havel said that he was against, rejected violence, not because it wasn't radical enough, but because it was, not because it was too radical, rather, I reversed it, but because it wasn't radical enough. It didn't give you the kind of systemic change that was really needed. The other is that the system, however we might define that the movement is up against, has a fantastic reserve of violence at its disposal. And if you go up against it, I think you're just going to lose. So what you're really faced with, I think, is two kinds of action, which are really quite separate and distinct and shouldn't be mixed up. And also two kinds of power. And the one is the destructive power of force, and the other is the creative power of nonviolence, which we've seen so beautifully exemplified in Zuccotti Park and around the country in the general assemblies and so on. The idea of building something up, of acting the way you want to see things go, and holding that out as an example to the rest of the country and a kind of inspiration. And indeed, the country did take inspiration, and everybody says that it changed the conversation. And that's true. It also changed Barack Obama's political campaign. And I think it's changed the Republican race, too, but that's another story. Anyway, that's proposition number one. I've got three of them. Two is very quick. I think a movement needs to have a way to commit itself to things, whether that's to greater equality or it's to nonviolence. In other words, it needs, and so it needs a way, some means, some instrument, some assembly or something for committing itself to nonviolence. And more broadly, and this is number three, that means having a means in general of self-correction. Because a movement without self-correction, and perhaps that's what we're about here today, can become a danger to itself and others. You know, back in Eastern Europe, in fighting against Soviet totalitarianism, they coined the phrase self-limiting revolution. So an idea of limitation, of restraint, was built into that movement. Likewise, when Gandhi's movement turned violent in 1922, he suspended it. He called it off and said he had to offer satyagraha against ourselves. So I think it's very important for a movement to be able to correct itself and take steps back and move in new directions. Well, finally, those are my three propositions. But after having said that, number four is that I have to really kind of throw my hands up and say, I don't know how to implement this. Certainly the horizontal way of making decisions is one of the glories of the movement, one of its splendors. But maybe is constituted now, and I don't know if this is true or not, that the insistence on consensus robs the movement of something that could be very important for it, and that's self-definition, which is another way of saying self-determination, which is, I think, one of the points of the whole exercises. And I've read the very interesting exchange between Chris Hedges and David Graeber, fascinating, and they're better versed in this discussion than I am. So I don't know what the way out is. I do know, though, that the questions that are on the table, they certainly go back to the 1960s, but they go back way before then. And Hannah Arendt, to name somebody who's pertinent to the New School, used to teach here, was sort of a great advocate of the council system that grew up in many revolutions of the 20th century. Spontaneous self-organization, usually of workers, but often of others as well. And these questions were put on the table then, and they're still on the table, and they're genuinely, I think, historically unanswered. So we've got roughly 4.5 hours to go, so maybe someone will come up with the answers. Thank you.
So the format here is we're going to open up for conversation from other panelists who haven't spoken yet, and I think we should take maybe 15 or 20 minutes to do that, and then get some comments and input from the audience, and that's what these microphones at the front are for. So I see Todd's hand, Steve's hand, David?
If called on.
Okay. Go ahead, Todd.
I have four. I have four propositions too, but brief. By way of opening the horizon, many of us have wondered whether there was ever going to be a movement, and just when it seemed that could not happen, it happened. I think something actually has happened which is beyond a movement. The movement has for so long, for so many of us, occupied the upper reaches of the noosphere that it's hard to imagine that something else is afoot, something even larger. But I think something larger is afoot, and it's very much in the American grain, and I'm coming to think of it as an awakening. America has been through, arguably 5 of them or so, the awakening of the 17th century, which delivered the Protestants, the protesting Protestants, some of them here, with rather grandiose ideas about being God's new Israel and founding what was not only a political system, in fact, not even so much a political system as a cultural system or a way of life. Then the so-called Great Awakening of the early 18th century, which is mostly remembered as a source of vivid Calvinist rhetoric, and was certainly that, but was also a run-up to the American Revolution, because it forged a way of talking about redemption with an idea about a political founding, a republic, which was actually the prevailing idea of the so-called founding fathers. Then there was an awakening in the early 19th century, much of which took the form of religious zeal and fractionation of denominations, one of which was, of course, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it was also the seedbed, in many ways, of the abolitionist movement, which in turn had enormous meaning in the larger life of America. And then there was the awakening of the late 19th, early 20th century, which generally had a Christian fundamentalist tone, but also had significant influence on the way people lived, specifically the temperance movement. And then I think the 60s were their own kind of awakening. Now, what's the difference between an awakening and a movement? Awakening actually has bigger game, is after bigger game. Because an awakening is not only an aspiration or a strategic vector toward a goal, but it's actually concerned about a way of life and radical changes to a way of life. Now, those changes don't all line up, and there are within this movement or within Occupy many tendencies, some more ambitious and extravagant than others, and obviously they all have different implications. But the quality of transformation that is, I think, afoot actually extends to the level that Jonathan's Havel is talking about. That is to say, they head toward a reconsideration of the fundamentals of the civilization. I know that's grand. If it comes to pass, as David Graeber has so instructed us, that we're staring at the possibility of rescinding 4,000 years of debt, so be it. That may be one dimension of the awakening. Second point.
Todd, just faster with the points.
Okay, faster. Within every movement and within awakenings, there are 2 tendencies that always recur. One of them is more or less the force of self-regard. It's self-examination. And the other is the force that thinks about organizing and mobilizing outside. And we have both tendencies here. In any movement, both are important, and both have to be attended to. But there is, in my view, a risk that at this moment, there's so much energy going into self-regard, self-preoccupation, self-maintenance, that we are detaching ourselves from the larger imperatives, which have to do with transforming a very large world dominated by very powerful forces in which billions of people live. And most of them are not in this room and not in our encampments. Third, the name of the political economic side of this system is plutocracy, and that is to say, rule by the wealthy. And it has been decades, it has been, of course, centuries in the making, but in its immediacy, it is 3 decades in the making. It will not be undermined in any significant way in the next 6 months. It is a way of life. It is, in fact, a system. And it won't be chipped away at either by assemblies or teach-ins or elections or the burning of flags. Fourth, what follows from this, in my view, and this is very abstract, I know, is that we ought to be thinking about a movement, an awakening and movement, which are, as I think of it, a full-service movement. A full-service movement is not a cadre. It is not a squad. It is not an organization. It is an array. It is, in fact, a sort of way of life in which there are forms of work that make sense, that contribute, for people of very different sorts. Some people who have no children, and some people who have lots of children, some people who work, some people who don't work, some people who are otherwise engaged, and so on and so on. And it offers something for all of them to do, which contributes. So the strategic questions that matter most to me are the ones about how to expedite the materialization of that full-service movement.
Thank you, very interesting, but everybody else on the panel, let's try to keep to about 2 minutes. Keep in mind, the longer you talk, the less they get to talk, and if you're angry, talk to those people. Anyway, let's have a few other comments. Who else wants to talk? Steve,
and then Marina.
Steve Max, I just want to quickly address a much narrower question here, which has come up. I guess the phrase that covers it is demonization, right? Don't demonize people who are more inclined toward violence, and then all of the reasons were kind of laid out of why one might be inclined toward violence, which I certainly understand. But those of my generation had a somewhat different experience with some of this, because we had very close personal friends who went down that same track. Todd, myself, Bill Phillips over here, Itzhak. I can't see other people because of the lights, but we knew folks who in 68, 69, people who we had worked with closely, were involved in the days of rage in Chicago, and were breaking windows and turning over cars, and I can't remember whether spray paint had been invented yet, but if it hadn't, it soon would be. And it was only a year or two after that when a few of them, blew themselves up not 2 blocks from here, and others in the next couple of years were your age when they got arrested, and they're my age now, and they're still in prison, and it was a goddamn waste, and it was dumb as hell. And it was our obligation, if we had only, I think about this all the time, right? If we had only had the forum, if there had only been the kind of open discussion, it was our obligation to tell them it was dumb as hell. It was our obligation to tell them, don't go down a path that's going to lead to building bombs and blowing yourself up. Now, nobody has done that yet. And, I was always told as a kid, if you smoked marijuana, the next step was heroin. And maybe it wasn't true, and maybe if you do some of the tactics people are talking about now, the next step isn't blowing yourself up, but maybe it is. And somebody's got to say it's dumb as hell, don't wreck your life.
I just want to say one thing in response to that. you know, there have been people doing black bloc for 20 years now, and none of them have gone on to blow themselves up. So I think we actually have learned something from that.
Okay, I'm kind of with YOTAM on this violence question, and I think in the next section, when we talk about ultimate goals, that would be a more appropriate place for the question of violence. And when we talk about short-term tactics, that could be a place for discussion of property destruction or not and distinguishing the two. What I love to talk about is the means, and the means being a part of our ends, so the prefigurative politics, the assemblies, and everything else. But now with a minute and a half. But just looking out, and I can't see either.
We're giving you 4 minutes.
No, that's all right. I'm good. I'm pretty good with time. I'm really about democracy. So who here has been involved in Occupy in some way or another? Participated, right? Who here felt empowered in that experience? Changed through the experience? Do you feel optimistic now? Right. See, this is kind of the point I want to make, and kind of countering the beginning point, is that while things are changing, the level of optimism is so incredibly high, and I think actually what we think is possible is even bigger than late September, which is why the next conversation about ultimate goals is so incredibly important, because the point I'm going to make under that one is about how seriously we need to take ourselves in transforming the system and society as a whole, and how we feel, and we feel empowered. This is New York, but think about the thousands of assemblies and places where people are gathering throughout just the United States. Villages. You know, there are 14 assemblies in Iowa, and a lot of them are people, farmers, over 50. So, I mean, the vastness and the depth of what's going on, and using forms of participatory democracy that in each place will kind of work out how it works. Does consensus work or not? I was in Spain over winter break, and there's a lot of criticism going on about, you know, they're doing their own self-criticism about the use of absolute consensus. They had a 14-hour assembly, for example, that some people thought was a little long. So, but they're doing that reflection, and I think it's really important. As we go through this, the important part is the transformation that's taking place within ourselves in that, and that we are feeling more powerful. And in that, and as we're transforming, and as we're creating this effective relationship as well, effective with an A, it allows us to think about more militant tactics as well. And militant can mean taking over hospitals, taking over schools, stopping foreclosures, whatever. But that kind of comes from this empowering place and feeling more powerful in these social relationships that are new and that are different that we're creating with each other. I did find, in talking with people in Spain, very similarly how they're organizing, less in the big squares and the big plazas, but in the neighborhoods, as we're doing in New York. It's not just working groups. There's Occupy in Sunset Park, in the Bronx, in downtown Brooklyn. There are more and more neighborhoods organizing assemblies in a more decentralized way, or re-territorializing what it looks like. That's true throughout Spain. That's true throughout Greece, where I also was in November. And the level of optimism also and sense of power is incredible in these different places where, you know, I've been fortunate to go, but I think we know all over the world that something is changing, and that's linked to this first point of the means. That participatory democracy, and as much as we can have criticisms of the process, there is something in that that's part of where we're getting this power, and I think it's an incredibly important part of the conversation.
Viola's going to speak. Are there other people on the panel who want to say anything before we hear from the audience? So, but you can go ahead, and if people want to line up and join the conversation, there are microphones here at the front. So, Viola.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to echo what you said. At Brooklyn College, we began having general assemblies after Occupy Wall Street started, but before that, we'd been doing our own organizing, and what I found is that, like, the General Assembly process was really inclusive, but we don't actually, it's not a decision-making body, more just like useful for outreach and bringing people in and empowering them in that space to then be a part of something that has more structure to it that makes decisions. And I think that's like important to be looking at for like how you're organizing yourself, why, like, maybe you could have a 14-hour meeting, like if it's to discuss what the tactics are, then yeah, that makes sense. But if you need to figure out what you're going to do tomorrow because there's an action, you might want to structure it a little more, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, so we'll take some comments and questions from the audience. If you'd like to identify yourself before you speak, that'd be great.
And once again, brief. Keep it as brief as possible. It doesn't have to necessarily be a question, but it should be relatively brief.
Yeah. because many of you have a lot of experience and have been very active in this movement. So please.
My name is No?
Yeah,
oh,
now it is. Okay.
It's on. My name is Cecily McMillan. Jim, you said that, or hinted at, that the facade of participatory said that it's possible that the participatory democracy General Assemblies sort of were possibly a facade as a front for the militant cadre. Do you think that if the number of violent actions were appropriately representative of the minority who wish to pursue violent tactics, that the majority, the nonviolent organizers, through nonviolent tactics and campaigns, could still maintain a face of the movement that is accessible to the general public at large? In other words, do a few acts of violence amongst a largely nonviolent movement necessarily undermine a consensus-based body committed to nonviolence and paint the movement as a whole as violent?
Okay. I want to look actually in David Graeber's way, because I think this is in part a question of media perception. And media perception is, media are mediated. And it's a complicated question about how, if you have, let me give you a concrete example. I'll take it from Oakland. I think the only time in Oakland that I'm aware of where there was actually a black bloc was during the second of the port shutdowns. First, what? Okay. But in any case, there was several thousand people shut down the port of Oakland, and then a smaller block of people afterwards went and broke some windows in downtown Oakland. The media covered the breakage of the windows more extensively than they covered this incredible mass action that shut down the port of Oakland. So in part, the question is, if a movement does not, out of reasons and principles of solidarity, disavow acts that the vast majority of people disagree with, it leaves the movement open to be portrayed and represented by others that have whatever other interests they do as being much more violent than it actually is if you're on the ground. And that's, I think, the risk that you run when you don't have an open discussion about these issues. And the problem is there a way to have that discussion without being demonizing and divisive? I think the take-home I had of what Rebecca was saying, is there a way to do this that's not the way of Chris Hedges, where we can put some of the issues on the table and be honest with each other about what's at stake? And obviously for a lot of people, breaking windows isn't really violence. It's not violence against persons. I would say the major advance of black bloc tactics is to rule out in advance violence against people as a matter of principle. You know, that doesn't take into account the perception of viewers who may not be part of that prior understanding of what the definition of violence is and what the limits of it are. So those are my comments.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that the key thing here, though, is how do you change those perceptions? You can't assume that perceptions are given. Successful social movements are ones that emphasize, you know, the violence against nonviolent protesters, and, you know, gradually people's attitudes towards what is an appropriate response change. And that's been successfully done in many parts of the world. And, you know, if you want to keep black blocs to a minimum, this is one thing I wanted to say. If we want to, even if that is your aim, it strikes me that the important thing to do is to make as much of an issue out of police violence against nonviolent protesters as possible. Because, you know, where there are why is there a large black bloc in Oakland and not in San Francisco where there's none? You know, it's only 15 minutes away. You know, it's because Oakland has a history of incredible police violence, continual murder of people of color, of poor community, people in queer communities. There's kind of a war been going on. I mean, ever since the Panthers, there's a reason the Panthers come from Oakland. So you know, it makes sense that even if you're trying to connect with the community around you, you're going to have more militant standards than someone in a community where people really have made an issue out of police violence to the point where police can't really do as much, and you can do nonviolent blockades without, you know, getting immediately smashed up. So I think, you know, the way to, you know, our task is to keep our eye on the ball, not talk about a broken window, say, why are you talking about a broken window over and over again, and talk about actual acts of violence like smashing in people's heads.
I just want to say something quickly as somebody who's actually been spending time in Oakland. So, Steve, I don't disagree with you at all, except about how we might actually not just alienate and make even more self-righteous people who disagree with us. It's just something you probably know a lot about from the 60s. So, but I also think that with what's been going on in Oakland, there's this thing we talk about called suicide by police, where you bait the police into shooting you. There's something that's almost like a kind of equivalent going on. What happened late on the night of November 2nd, after the amazing nonviolent port shut down by tens of thousands of people, is that, and I'm not even sure that Black Bloc is a good label for the insurrectionists here who like to smash things up. But they like, everything had been great. We didn't really have anything to struggle about, but they were supposedly going to take over a building. Lots of stuff happened. But basically they baited the police into freaking out, and police are the easiest people on earth to bait. Like, there's no challenge in it. There's no victory in it. And all the sleeping people in Oscar Grant Plaza, including disabled people, people with children, etc., were suddenly attacked by the police as part of this thing. So it's really, I think, a lot of what we're talking about is what gets, and this is sort of insider stuff, but diversity of tactics has been this phrase for anything goes, we have no action agreements. I think there should be action agreements, and that people who want to do something that's not within the framework of the larger group of, do something outside the group where it's like, we're not with these people, we're doing our own thing, which is, different. But that's getting all tactical and specific, and we're not really doing that right now. Except that we are.
Victory, by the way, would be convincing the police that they should be on our side, which in class terms they should be. Go ahead.
I wish to remain anonymous, not associated with the hackers.
Talking to the microphone, even if you're anonymous.
Can you hear me? Okay, since we all agree on nonviolence, I think it's more important that we decide what constitutes violence. So sort of psychological violence is created with the duality of 99% and 1%, and victimizing the 99% and demonizing the 1%. We fail to recognize the philosophical and spiritual suffering of the 1%. Once we reframe the focus to 100%, we can all work together in non-duality. So in order to move forward, we must find ways of offering olive branches to the 1% so we can work in cooperation.
We want their olive branches, and we want them now.
Of course, but I feel like maybe we're being more combative, and maybe they don't want to work with us.
We're not nice enough to them?
Yeah.
We need to liberate them from their privilege.
I would actually, we're willing to do that, but we need to talk about what that would look like.
If I could comment on that, a friend of mine made a great analogy when someone else brought up a similar point, which was that it's like an abusive spouse. So it's not about demonizing the spouse, but the abuse is real. Right?
Of course.
So when we are dealing with a situation of serious domestic violence, it's not about saying that the abuser is evil, but it is about addressing the situation in a way that it doesn't provide forgiveness for someone who's not asking for it, right? And so I think when it comes to a place of dialogue, that's where we need to bring forgiveness, and we need to act out of love when it comes to a space of dialogue. But I don't see any dialogue between the powers that be and the people who are asking for participatory democracy.
I think they are asking for it. They don't.
Let's keep it going. Let's go over here.
Hi, I'm Chris. I want the respondents on Jim's panel to be more explicit to his criticisms, to respond more about the kind of facade character of participatory democracy, and if there is kind of a de facto group of people who are in power that are taking sway over this participatory model, modes of going about things, then what would it mean if you were to actually take seriously if the Occupy Wall Street movement were to follow more of like a vanguardist model or democratic centralist model? Like, take that seriously for a minute. I would just be curious, if that happens by default, would you, Occupy Wall Street, actually want to own something like that?
Can I actually just make a suggestion as all, because there's so many of us sitting up here, so that we can have more of a discussion that we actually don't respond to every comment and that people can comment and respond to each other? We could cluster them or whatever, but that's so that it's not just a back and forth, which was not the intention.
Well, let's take one or two more things in that, but let's remember that because that's a good question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Skanda Kavadrama. I'm a New School student. I wanted to frame this this question in terms of what David wrote, points that David rose, the sort of notion that we see violence in a kind of vacuum as opposed to looking at what we could call warfare conditions in the cities we live in, right? So I hear Jim and others talking about how their experience in the 60s. My experience growing up in the late 80s and the early 90s was framed by the shooting of Amadou Diallo, the violation of Abner Louima, and just of late, Ray Kelly releases a 90-minute interview about why all Muslims are essentially terrorists. And why is it, then, when we have moments like this, why do we ideologically filter out those instances and focus on spray paint, a couple of black blocs, and somehow a bomb gets worked into this? Why are those the tropes of violence and not police brutality, essentially?
Well, let's take one more question and then we'll have some response. Go ahead.
Okay. I would consider myself somebody who's on the periphery because I never slept on the street. I visited a few times. I took part in a march. I almost got arrested because they had the kettling stuff ready for us. I think it's really important to think about the widespread support that you already enjoy with OWS and that could be indeed fostered more. I'm really very encouraged by the fact that it's been so widely spread over the internet. And I feel that protecting the internet from the many attacks, we pushed down SOPA and PIPA, and now we have ACTA to deal with, and just what happened a few days ago with Komen, with the outpouring of protests that actually pushed them to at least seem to change their position. I'd like to hear more about fostering the support from people who aren't going to come sleep on the street, but who are the 99% and whose hearts are with OWS.
Let's thank you very much. Let's take in some of those. Any comments on the one hand, you're being asked to respond to the violence of the surrounding context, but also the others are being, some of the rest of us are being asked to respond to the prospect of vanguard and democratic centralism, and then finally, how do we reach out to the rest?
Well, let me say something. I want to pick up a thread that I thought Jonathan SCHELL made a very good point. I don't remember whether it was your third or fourth point about how does the importance for a nonviolent, strategic nonviolent political movement to be able to define itself and restrain itself. And one of the things that I think is a conversation that I see beginning to occur in Occupy, which you referred to, Rebecca, is what's the nomenclature? Action commitments?
Action agreements.
Action agreements. Because it's a mechanism by which you can very clearly affiliate a movement with certain kinds of actions rather than other kinds of actions. So I think that one of the things about the current moment is the effort to try to devise solutions to problems that emerge in strategic nonviolent movements as well as the 60s. If a strategic nonviolent movement is successful, it will highlight police violence, because the only people being violent and visibly violent will be the police. That is one of the reasons I think why Gandhi, when there was a flare-up of violence in his own movement, withdrew, because you had to press the reset button. The moral force of a strategic nonviolent movement is the self-restraint it exercises, often in the face of great provocation and often at risk of life in the case of the South in the 60s. Because in the South, police would kill people. It wasn't just beat people. So that's a comment on self-restraint and how important I think it is at this juncture.
The question was raised about people to respond to the first part of Jim's comments about how cadres and groupings and so forth start manipulating the wider General Assembly. If that's happening, have you had a sense that that's happening? Have you had a concern about that happening? And if it did happen, would you be able to deal with it? I'm addressing more people directly in OWS.
Yeah, I'll take a really quick crack at it, and I'm going to be very brief because I'd rather go back to you all. And so I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty about the things that happen behind the scenes at Occupy Wall Street, and a lot happens. It's a big movement. We're all trying to figure out our relationships with each other. It's not always pretty. It's sometimes not very pretty. Anyway, but I think the point of it, and just to go towards thinking about the future instead of getting bogged down in what's happened or hasn't happened, I think the question is, how do we create systems and institutions that allow a movement to develop over the long run? And I think that is a question that can apply both to the issues that people have brought up about violence or nonviolence, and to the issues of leadership and decision making and stuff like that. I think we would be wrong to pretend that there's no such thing as power just because we hate that people use their power against us. Just like capitalism doesn't, wither away just because we don't like it. It's something that you have to actually crash into and have an alternative to, and those things have to happen at the same time. Same thing about leadership. A movement that has no structures for accountability or transparency or proper participatory decision-making processes is a movement that's most easy for people who are most conditioned to be in leadership roles to take power in that. And look at me, you know what I mean? Like, just like nice looking white boy. It's like really easy for, you know what I mean? And that's something we have to actually create structures and institutions to protect the movement that we have, and keep leaders are not the problem. A lack of accountability and lack of transparency is a problem. So we have to create structures to work through all that stuff. And then just really quickly about the point that you made about why are we like harassing ourselves about broken windows and bombs and stuff like that instead of talking about police brutality? I think you're right, absolutely right on an ethical level, and I don't really want to even get into the questions of whether it's ethical or not ethical to use violence in such and that's why I said earlier that it's about context. I don't really even this system is incredibly violent, and no amount of broken windows will ever add up to the misery of loss of human potential that these systems of oppression have yielded. So that's not even so you're absolutely right, but I think the question, and the reason that people have brought in their experiences from the past, I think the question is what's right for our movement. How do we resist it best? So it's to me, again, it's not a question about whether it's right or not. It's a question about what will build the movement and what will allow us to win. And I think it's going to take a whole lot to win, and who knows what that'll mean in 10 or 20 years. But that's the reason that I'm not so concerned about that question right now.
We have about 4 more minutes of the session, so some quick comments, please.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. I'm Lena Bokar. I'm active in Occupy Wall Street. I'm in Arts and Labor and Occupy Sunset Park. And I guess I wanted to address this to Jim and Todd and Marina. I was here for the New School occupation, and I guess I kind of want like a micro-analysis from the outside point of view of there's violence. I think there were threats. I think there was racism and class issues. Of course, it's going to happen because it's a microcosm of our society. But maybe a little bit of the hypocrisy or just the contradictions in the nature of the New School was founded as a university in exile. Now it's one of the most expensive schools in New York. And I'm an alum of the New School, so it's all these contradictions are very real. So in terms of occupying hospitals, occupying education, what would an occupied New School revisionist or another occupation look like? Would you have free classes? It's a very complicated thing, but would you just have this 1 week when administrators have granted us a space and then we act out a little bit? Now that space is gone and the $40,000 could have gone to TAs. It's how about for tenured pay cuts? But that's a micro level. But I don't know. I'm really interested. I'm in Arts and Labor, which deals with arts and labor issues, inequalities, adjunct professor issues. And I just saw this. I'll wrap it up. But I just saw the Weather Underground speak. Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, and I know there's history with you guys on this. But basically, they said we're all complicit in sanitary acts of violence. So there is, we're U.S. citizens. We're a global empire. So whether or not it's in a protest or not, like we're all complicit in this. So thank you.
Let's take two more quick comments here.
So this is I'm Yoni Miller from Occupy Wall Street. This is a comment for Todd and YOTAM. I'm not sure if I completely agree with you, Todd, about how we were emphasizing too much about the internal politics, because I feel it's very reflective of the greater society that we're dealing with. And the other thing is, I'm not sure if you appreciate the difficulty that we had, especially in the winter, in terms of the suppression, whether it was the housing issues or, the floating rumors about the finances, which split up a lot of people. A lot of people left because it's cold. They lost a lot of optimism for the movement. And I personally am very optimistic for Occupy Wall Street. But at the same time, and YOTAM, I agree with you here, I don't think, shutting down ports or like the February 29th actions are going to actually chip away at capitalism. That doesn't make sense, but it's only through, raising conscious awareness and making a political transformation that we'll be able to make any change. The only way to do that, though, would be to, be creating actions that give us the sense that we're having, or giving us a taste of democracy. I don't think we actually have a real democracy, but I think it's self-empowering, but at the same time, we're not really, we are not actually taking over any institutions that we don't have power, and I think the fight is a lot harder than a lot of us are giving credit for.
Last quick comment.
Hey, I just wanted to say in defense of the person who said that if we're kinder to the 99%, that they'll be kinder to us. That
the 1%.
The 1%, excuse me. that is no less reasonable than saying that if we're nicer to the cops, they'll be nicer to us. They oppress us. That's why they're the 99%. That's why they're the cops. I also wanted to address the question of how has violence been effective in the past 40 years. A good example would be Greensboro, North Carolina, which is, of course, famous for the sit-ins in 1960. But the city was not desegregated in 1960. The school system was not desegregated until 1970, after years of nonviolence which were not effective, and only after there was a major riot at the local black college. So that's not a question of ethics, per se. That's a question of effectiveness. So we should think about that. And we should also note that when we talk about the Weather Underground, we ask where did they get these crazy-ass ideas. They got a lot of these ideas from a segment of the civil rights movement, which was a very crucial segment. And also, speaking of the civil rights movement, and speaking of the media, there was an interview with Harry Belafonte about Occupy Wall Street and what his advice to the movement was. And his primary advice was not to worry about the media, because the media will hate you either way. They hated Dr. King up until the point where scarier people started coming around, and he started seeming like the safer alternative. And of course, after he was dead, they lionized him. But when he was alive, he was considered to be the enemy, and they tried to find every fault they possibly could with him, and blamed him for the violence.
Okay. Thank you. Rather than have people, all of us, respond to those particular things, I think it's going to be talked about in the next sections as well. Jim, I wanted you just to have a few last comments. It was your panel.
Well, what I wanted to do is, I was trying to think in preparing for this conversation what I thought some of the tensions were, and why, in some ways, I think Occupy is kind of at a crossroads. And I think it's because that there was this amazing moment. I'm going back now to the moment of hope in the honeymoon period, where against all odds, and I think nobody really expected that it would happen, and why it happened is not entirely clear, but you had a handful of seasoned, dedicated organizers who were able to put into place and put on the agenda not just a slogan about the 99%, but put into play a process that was radically democratic, that offered hope of not just social and political transformation, but personal transformation. All of that happened very suddenly, and I think in many ways unexpectedly, at least when I read the interviews that David Graeber has given about this. He expressed surprise. I think as a result of this, what happened, which again people have talked about, was the sudden appearance of the rudiments of what could be a mass movement. You had general assemblies in thousands of cities across the United States. You had all kinds of people drawn in by the energy and the hope of that moment. Many of them are still around. So here's why I see this as posing a challenge and putting Occupy at a crossroads. On the one hand, you have the people who basically ignited this moment, who are, if you read David's book on direct action, it's like a cookbook of how you do exemplary acts of resistance, how you organize acts of very focused insurrection, where you take space back from the powers that be. And there's a long, honorable tradition of that kind of organizing outside the system. If you look at the mass movement part of this, what it meant in practice is suddenly, say in New York City, you had people from trade unions, you had Democratic Assembly people, you had old, peaceniks, all were in the streets in huge marches in sympathy with Occupy. And the question of, the tension between these two, it's a real question, because if you go in the direction of exemplary acts, you can alienate the people in the mass movement. If you go in the direction of the mass movement, you could end up co-opting the utopian energies and the things you really cared about, which is a way of saying that I think Marina was actually right, that we had an analytic distinction here, and the only way to really think clearly about the tensions and the problems is to ask, what are the ultimate goals of this movement? Because it has become so large and so variegated, it's not entirely clear that we even agree, all of us, on those ultimate goals, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next panel.
Right. So we'll take a 10-minute break. Listen, before we take a break, one of the things that will keep this country great and growing are independent bookstores. One of them is back there. This is free. There are some great writers on this panel. Their books are out there. Go buy their books.